The moment people stop asking what you think is usually the moment they believe they have already won. That thought stayed quietly in my mind as I sat at the polished walnut conference table inside Daniel Foster's downtown Chicago office. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking the city skyline, while neat stacks of legal documents rested between crystal glasses of water and polished fountain pens. Everything about the room suggested calm professionalism, yet I could feel an invisible current moving beneath the surface. My son Michael sat beside his wife, Rebecca, both dressed with the quiet confidence of people who believe the difficult part of the day had already passed. Rebecca smiled warmly as she adjusted a folder in front of her before glancing toward me. "I think once everything is finalized, everyone will feel much more at peace," she said with genuine kindness. Michael nodded immediately. Dad always wanted the family to stay together. I think this is exactly what he would have wanted. I smiled politely, but said nothing. Silence often reveals more than disagreement ever could. Across the table, Daniel carefully reviewed several routine documents without rushing. He spoke calmly, explaining each page with the same steady professionalism Harold had always admired. 8 months had passed since my husband died, and throughout those months I had slowly learned that grief changes more than a person's heart. It changes how other people look at you. Friends begin offering advice before asking what you want. Family members make careful suggestions that slowly become expectations. People stop asking whether you are ready because they quietly decide you should be. Rebecca was never cruel. In many ways, she had been wonderfully supportive after Harold passed away. She brought meals during the first difficult weeks, helped organize family photographs, and often stopped by simply to keep me company. I appreciated every thoughtful gesture she offered. Yet somewhere between helping and planning, something subtle had changed. She no longer spoke about the future as though it belonged to all of us equally. She spoke as though it had already unfolded. While Daniel reviewed another document, Rebecca leaned toward Michael and whispered something that made them both smile before she glanced toward me again. "The house has always been perfect for family gatherings," she said warmly. "I cannot wait to keep those traditions going for years to come." Michael smiled. "The grandchildren are going to love growing up there." I looked at both of them before quietly lowering my eyes to the documents in front of me. Neither statement sounded disrespectful. Neither sounded demanding. Yet both carried the same quiet assumption. They spoke about tomorrow as though today's decision had already been made. Daniel finally looked up from the paperwork. "Mrs. Collins," he said politely, "before we continue, there is one matter we will address after reviewing these preliminary documents." I simply nodded. Rebecca remained completely relaxed, apparently believing it was another routine legal formality. Watching her confidence reminded me how easily people mistake silence for agreement. They assume that because someone does not argue, that person has already surrendered. They mistake patience for weakness and kindness for uncertainty. I had once made the same mistake myself many years earlier before Harold gently taught me that the strongest people often spoke the least. As Daniel organized another folder, my thoughts drifted backward exactly 48 hours earlier. I remembered standing alone inside the kitchen where Harold and I had shared thousands of ordinary mornings together. The telephone rang unexpectedly, interrupting the quiet rhythm of another lonely afternoon. I answered without looking at the caller identification, never imagining that one simple conversation would completely change the way I understood everything my husband had quietly prepared long before he left this world. "Mrs. Collins," the familiar voice said calmly. "This is Daniel Foster. There is something your husband specifically instructed me to place in your hands when the right moment finally arrived. I believe that moment is now." Daniel asked whether I could meet him privately the following afternoon at his office overlooking downtown Chicago. His voice remained calm and reassuring, the same steady tone Harold always trusted whenever legal matters required careful attention. I stood quietly in the kitchen holding the telephone while afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor Harold had installed more than 25 years earlier. Outside the window, the flower garden he loved so much was beginning to bloom again, filling the backyard with color despite everything our family had endured during the previous 8 months. "Is something wrong?" I asked gently. Daniel paused before answering. "Nothing is wrong, Mrs. Collins. Your husband simply left very specific instructions regarding several documents that he wanted you to receive personally, but only when I believed you were ready to understand them." His answer immediately reminded me of Harold. Throughout our marriage, he never rushed important conversations. He believed timing often mattered just as much as truth itself. "I will be there," I replied quietly. After we ended the call, I remained standing beside the kitchen counter for several minutes, thinking about the countless evenings Harold had disappeared into his home office during the final year of his life. Whenever I asked whether he was working too hard, he always smiled and assured me he was simply putting everything in order so I would never have unnecessary burdens to carry alone. At the time, I believed he was organizing financial records and insurance papers. I never imagined he might have been preparing something much more personal. The following afternoon, I drove into downtown Chicago beneath clear spring skies. Daniel's office occupied the upper floor of a beautifully restored brick building overlooking the Chicago River. The receptionist welcomed me warmly before leading me into a quiet conference room furnished with polished walnut tables, leather chairs, and large windows that filled the room with soft natural light. A single cream-colored envelope rested neatly in the center of the table. Even before I sat down, I recognized Harold's handwriting across the front. My name appeared exactly as he had written it on birthday cards, anniversary letters, and every Christmas gift during 46 years of marriage. Daniel entered carrying a slim leather portfolio before taking the chair across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he gently rested one hand on the envelope. "Harold gave this to me nearly a year before he passed away," he explained. "He instructed me not to deliver it immediately after his death. He wanted you to receive it only after enough time had passed for grief to settle, and only if circumstances suggested people might begin making important decisions before you had fully found your own footing again." I slowly looked from the envelope to Daniel. Did he believe something like that would happen? Daniel smiled kindly before shaking his head. No, Harold did not predict specific people or specific events. He simply understood how families often change after a great loss. He wanted to make certain your voice would never disappear beneath everyone else's good intentions. Those words stayed with me as I carefully lifted the envelope into my hands. The paper itself felt ordinary, yet somehow it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Harold had always believed love was not measured by grand gestures. It was measured by quiet preparation, thoughtful patience, and protecting the people who mattered most long after you were no longer there to stand beside them. As I gently opened the envelope and unfolded the first page, I realized that everything I believed I understood about the months following Harold's passing was about to change in ways I never expected. My hands rested quietly on Harold's letter as Daniel gave me all the time I needed to begin reading. Outside the conference room windows, the Chicago River reflected the soft afternoon sunlight, while boats drifted slowly across the water. Everything beyond the glass continued as though it were an ordinary day, yet I already sensed that this quiet afternoon would become one of the most important moments of my life. I unfolded the first page carefully, immediately recognizing Harold's steady handwriting. The opening sentence alone brought tears to my eyes. "My dearest Margaret, if this letter has reached your hands, then life has placed you at a crossroads where other voices may sound louder than your own. Before you listen to anyone else, remember something I have always known. No one has ever understood your heart better than you." I stopped reading for several seconds, taking a slow breath before continuing. Harold never mentioned Michael. He never mentioned Rebecca. He never warned me about specific people or questioned anyone's intentions. Instead, he wrote about grief itself. He explained that losing a lifelong partner often causes people to doubt their own judgment, making them more likely to follow confident voices simply because making decisions alone feels overwhelming. One sentence seemed to echo inside the quiet room long after I finished reading it. "Never allow another person's confidence to replace your own peace." I gently lowered the letter onto the polished table, while Daniel quietly opened the leather portfolio beside him. Inside were several neatly organized legal documents bearing Harold's signature, each dated nearly 11 months before his passing. Daniel carefully arranged them before speaking in the calm, professional manner that had earned Harold's trust for many years. "Your husband revised several portions of his estate plan," he explained. "These amendments do not remove anyone from future inheritance, nor do they change Harold's long-term wishes for the family. Their purpose is much simpler." I looked up from the documents. "What purpose?" I asked softly. Daniel smiled with quiet understanding. to protect your independence. He slowly pointed towards several highlighted provisions while explaining each one in plain language. Harold had established that every significant decision involving our home, our property, or any permanent change would remain entirely my choice until I freely decided otherwise. No one could persuade me through urgency. No one could present paperwork expecting immediate signatures. Every important decision required my complete understanding and voluntary consent. I listened carefully while Daniel patiently answered every question I asked. Nothing about the documents felt complicated or dramatic. There were no hidden conditions, no elaborate legal traps, and no attempt to punish anyone. Harold had done something remarkably simple. He had protected my right to decide my own future. Did Harold believe I would need this? I finally asked. Daniel folded his hands together before answering. Harold believed that after such a great loss, people often begin trying to help before they fully understand what the person grieving actually needs. He never doubted your family loved you. He simply wanted to make certain love never became pressure. His answer sounded exactly like Harold. Throughout our marriage, he never tried to solve every problem for me. Instead, he encouraged me to trust myself enough to solve them beside him. Suddenly, I remembered all those evenings during his final year when he quietly reviewed papers inside his home office, assuring me everything was simply routine. He had not been preparing for conflict. He had been preserving my voice for the day his own would no longer be there to support it. Daniel carefully returned the legal documents to their folder before sliding Harold's letter back toward me. "Take this home," he said kindly. "Read it again before Friday's meeting. Your husband wanted you to arrive there carrying certainty instead of uncertainty." As I carefully folded the letter and placed it inside my handbag, I realized Harold had left me something infinitely more valuable than property. He had quietly restored my confidence before anyone else realized how easily it could be taken away. When I returned home from Daniel's office that afternoon, the house greeted me with the same peaceful silence that had filled every room since Harold passed away. Yet something inside me had changed. For months, I had walked through those familiar hallways feeling as though every decision rested on uncertain ground. Now, for the first time, I understood that Harold had quietly built a foundation beneath me long before I realized I would ever need one. I placed my handbag on the kitchen counter before walking slowly through the house. The afternoon sunlight reached across the hardwood floors, warming the same rooms where we had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas mornings, and ordinary evenings that eventually became treasured memories. Harold always believed a home collected pieces of the people who loved it. Standing there, I could almost hear his quiet laughter drifting from the living room where he once sat reading every evening beside the fireplace. I carried his letter into the study and carefully placed it on the polished oak desk where he had spent so many evenings organizing papers during the final year of his life. Looking around the room, I suddenly remembered dozens of moments that had seemed completely ordinary at the time. Harold reviewing folders after dinner. Harold making brief telephone calls behind a closed door. Harold smiling whenever I asked whether something was wrong and gently saying that he simply wanted everything to be in good order. Back then I thought he was preparing for retirement paperwork. Now I realized he had been preparing me for life without him. As I sat quietly in his chair, other memories slowly returned, memories that no longer seemed quite as ordinary. After Harold's funeral, Rebecca had visited often, bringing meals, helping organize closets, and making certain I never spent too many evenings alone. Her kindness had always felt genuine, and I never questioned her intentions. Little by little, however, our conversations began changing. At first she asked whether I needed help around the house. Then she wondered whether maintaining such a large property might become difficult. Eventually, she started talking about future possibilities instead of present needs. She admired the neighborhood, mentioned how perfect the house would be for children, and occasionally described renovation ideas that could modernize the kitchen while preserving its charm. None of those conversations felt inappropriate by themselves. Families naturally imagine the future together. Yet sitting in Harold's study with his letter resting beside me, I realized every conversation quietly moved in the same direction. Michael changed more gradually. During the first months after his father's passing, he called nearly every evening simply to make certain I had eaten dinner and was doing well. As time passed, practical questions slowly replaced emotional ones. Instead of asking how I was sleeping, He asked whether mowing the lawn had become too difficult. Instead of asking whether I felt lonely, he wondered whether living alone inside such a large house still made sense. His concern was sincere, but somewhere along the way he stopped asking what I wanted and began assuming what would be best for me. Neither Michael nor Rebecca had ever demanded anything from me. That was what made everything so subtle. They were not trying to take control through force. They were doing it through certainty. They believed they were helping, and because I rarely disagreed, they slowly mistook my quiet nature for agreement. Harold understood something I had not seen until now. The greatest danger was never open conflict. It was allowing everyone else's confidence to slowly become louder than my own voice. As evening settled across the neighborhood, I folded Harold's letter carefully and placed it inside the top drawer of his desk beside the estate documents Daniel had reviewed with me. Then I quietly closed the drawer and smiled for the first time in many months. I no longer needed to argue with anyone. Sometimes the strongest preparation begins by saying nothing at all, while everyone else continues believing the story will end exactly the way they imagined. The next morning I woke before sunrise with a feeling I had not experienced since Harold passed away. It was not excitement, and it was certainly not relief. It was clarity. The uncertainty that had quietly followed me from room to room during the previous 8 months seemed noticeably lighter. Harold's letter rested safely inside the top drawer of his desk, and although I had already read every word twice, I no longer needed to unfold it again. Its message had already settled inside me. He had never told me what decision to make. He had simply reminded me that the decision had always belonged to me. I spent the morning tending the flower beds along the front walkway, trimming the rose bushes Harold planted nearly 20 years earlier. Neighbors waved as they passed, stopping for a few minutes to admire the spring blooms before continuing their morning walks. Everything about the neighborhood felt comfortingly familiar. Life had continued moving forward despite loss, just as Harold always believed it would. Shortly after lunch, Michael called. His voice carried an easy confidence that immediately told me he believed the coming meeting would simply confirm what everyone already expected. "Good afternoon, Mom," he said warmly. "Rebecca and I were thinking about stopping by tomorrow evening before our appointment with Daniel on Friday. We thought we could all have dinner together." "That sounds nice," I replied. "I would enjoy that." He laughed softly. "Good. After Friday, everything will probably feel a lot more settled." I noticed the sentence immediately. He never asked whether I felt ready. He assumed readiness would naturally arrive once the paperwork was complete. "Sometimes the most important things take longer than paperwork," I answered gently. He paused for only a moment before responding. "That is true. Well, we will see you tomorrow." The following evening they arrived carrying a warm apple pie from the local bakery along with fresh flowers for the dining room table. Rebecca hugged me warmly before walking naturally into the kitchen to place the pie beside the coffee maker. Watching her move comfortably through the house reminded me how familiar every room had become to her. She truly loved spending time there, and I never doubted that. During dinner we laughed about old family vacations, Harold's famous Saturday morning pancakes, and the time he insisted on assembling an outdoor gazebo without reading the instructions first. For a little while, everything felt wonderfully normal. Then, as coffee replaced dessert, the conversation slowly drifted toward the future. Rebecca smiled while looking around the dining room. "I have been thinking about how beautiful the house will look during Christmas once the grandchildren are old enough to decorate every room," she said. "There is so much space for everyone to gather." Michael nodded enthusiastically. "Dad always wanted this place filled with family." Rebecca continued speaking with the same quiet confidence she had shown for months. "I even found someone who specializes in preserving older hardwood floors without changing their original character. It would be wonderful to modernize just enough while keeping everything your husband built." She spoke naturally, almost absent-mindedly, as though discussing plans that were already waiting for the calendar rather than ideas still requiring a decision. I smiled politely and stirred my coffee without disagreeing. "Harold always believed a house teaches patience," I said softly. "It never rewards people who hurry through its seasons." Rebecca smiled kindly, perhaps believing I was simply remembering one of Harold's favorite sayings. The conversation quickly moved to other subjects before they gathered their coats to leave. As I stood alone on the front porch watching their car disappear down the quiet suburban street, I realized my silence had accomplished exactly what I intended. They still believed Friday would unfold exactly as they imagined. They believed the meeting would simply confirm plans already made in their minds. They never realized that while they spent months preparing for signatures, Harold had quietly prepared me to recognize the difference between someone else's certainty and my own choice. Friday morning arrived beneath a clear blue sky, and for the first time since Harold's passing, I did not wake with uncertainty sitting beside me. Grief was still present, just as real as it had been 8 months earlier, but it no longer directed my thoughts. Before leaving the house, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and carried my favorite mug onto the back porch overlooking the flower garden Harold and I had planted together one spring after another. The tulips were standing tall beneath the morning sun, opening naturally without anyone urging them to bloom sooner. Harold often said that nature never rushed, yet everything arrived exactly when it should. As I finished my coffee, I slipped Harold's handwritten letter and the folder Daniel had given me into my leather handbag before locking the front door. I paused on the porch and looked back at the house for a long moment. Every room inside held a chapter of our family story. The living room where Michael learned to walk. The dining room where every Thanksgiving table overflowed with laughter. The study where Harold quietly prepared a future he knew he would never personally see. Whatever happened during today's meeting, I already understood one important truth. This was never simply about property. It was about preserving my ability to choose my own future. During the drive into downtown Chicago, Michael called. His voice sounded relaxed, almost cheerful. "Good morning, Mom," he said. "Rebecca and I are already on our way. Hopefully everything will go smoothly today." "I hope so too," I answered warmly. "Drive carefully. I will see both of you soon." After ending the call, I smiled to myself. Michael still believed today's meeting would simply complete a process that had quietly been moving toward its expected conclusion. He had no reason to think otherwise because I had never argued with him. Sometimes silence is not surrender. Sometimes silence is simply patience waiting for the right moment. Daniel welcomed me into his office with the same quiet professionalism he had shown throughout our previous meeting. Before Michael and Rebecca arrived, we spent several minutes reviewing the documents once more. Daniel carefully explained each provision again, making certain I understood every page completely. There was never any pressure to reach a particular decision. Harold had specifically instructed him to make certain my understanding came before anyone else's expectations. When we finished, Daniel closed the folder and smiled kindly. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "today is not about convincing anyone. It is simply about protecting your ability to decide freely." I nodded. That is exactly what Harold wanted. A few minutes later, the receptionist escorted Michael and Rebecca into the conference room. Rebecca wore an elegant cream-colored blazer and greeted me with a warm embrace before complimenting my navy blue suit. Michael smiled and gently pulled out a chair for me just as his father had always done. The conference room looked exactly as it had 2 days earlier, with polished walnut furniture, neatly arranged legal documents, crystal glasses of water, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Everything felt calm, organized, and entirely ordinary. Rebecca chatted comfortably about the beautiful spring weather and how relieved she would be once everything was finally settled. Michael nodded in agreement, occasionally smiling toward Daniel whenever another routine document was reviewed. Neither of them noticed the slim leather portfolio resting quietly beside Daniel's chair, separate from every other folder already arranged on the table. They believed they had already seen every important document. I quietly folded my hands together and listened while Daniel reviewed the preliminary paperwork one careful page at a time. The atmosphere remained courteous and relaxed, yet I could sense something changing beneath the surface. Every person sitting around that polished conference table believed they already knew how the afternoon would end. Every person except the one who had finally remembered that her own signature still belonged entirely to her. Daniel quietly closed the final folder containing the routine estate paperwork and folded his hands together on the polished walnut table. The conference room became noticeably quieter, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because everyone sensed we had reached the moment they believed would require only a few signatures before everything was finished. Rebecca smiled politely toward Daniel while adjusting the sleeve of her cream-colored blazer. Michael leaned back comfortably in his chair, looking relieved that the meeting had unfolded exactly as expected. I remained silent, my hands resting gently beside the fountain pen lying in front of me. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the Chicago skyline, filling the room with a peaceful warmth that stood in sharp contrast to the quiet anticipation surrounding the table. Daniel slowly reached toward the slim leather portfolio that had remained unopened beside his chair throughout the entire meeting. It was the only folder no one else had mentioned. I noticed Rebecca glance toward it briefly before returning her attention to the documents already spread across the table. She appeared curious but not concerned. Like Michael, she seemed convinced that whatever remained inside would simply confirm everything already discussed. Daniel opened the portfolio with careful precision before removing several certified legal documents and the familiar cream-colored envelope containing Harold's handwritten letter. He arranged them neatly before speaking in the same calm professional voice he had used all afternoon. "Before we conclude today's meeting," he said, "there is one final matter that Harold Collins instructed me to address personally." Michael looked slightly surprised. "Dad left additional instructions?" he asked quietly. Daniel nodded respectfully. Approximately 11 months before Harold passed away, he revised several portions of his estate plan and directed me to keep these documents confidential until a meeting such as this became necessary. He gently turned the first page so everyone could clearly see Harold's unmistakable signature at the bottom. For a few moments no one spoke. The silence itself seemed to carry more weight than any explanation possibly could. Daniel continued without changing his calm tone. "These amendments do not alter Harold's love for his family or anyone's future inheritance. Their purpose is simply to ensure that every significant decision involving the family residence remains entirely Mrs. Collins' decision until she voluntarily chooses otherwise." Rebecca's confident smile gradually disappeared, replaced not by anger, but by genuine surprise. Michael leaned forward slightly, studying his father's signature with complete attention. He recognized that handwriting immediately. It had appeared on every birthday card, every graduation letter, every holiday gift throughout his entire life. Daniel then placed Harold's handwritten letter beside the legal documents without opening it. Harold also instructed that this letter remain private until after Mrs. Collins had received independent legal guidance, he explained. "She has already reviewed these materials with me earlier this week." Michael slowly turned toward me. "Mom, you already knew?" he asked softly. I nodded gently. Daniel wanted me to understand everything before today's meeting. There was no accusation in my voice because none was necessary. Daniel carefully slid the fountain pen a few inches closer to me before speaking again. "Mrs. Collins, if after reviewing everything you wish to sign documents today, you certainly may. However, Harold's instructions make equally clear that choosing not to sign today is fully protected under the revised estate plan." The room fell silent once more. Rebecca looked from the legal documents to Harold's letter and finally toward me. For the first time since Harold's passing, I no longer saw certainty in her expression. I saw understanding slowly replacing assumption. Everyone had entered the room believing today's outcome depended upon paperwork. Harold had quietly arranged something entirely different. He had ensured that the only signature which truly mattered would never belong to expectation, pressure, or anyone else's confidence. It would belong only to the woman he had trusted more than anyone else for the last 46 years of his life. The silence that settled over the conference room carried a different feeling now. It was no longer filled with uncertainty. Instead, it invited reflection. Harold had somehow managed to guide one final family conversation without ever sitting at the table himself. Daniel quietly closed the leather portfolio after allowing everyone enough time to study the revised estate documents. The afternoon sunlight continued pouring through the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago, warming the polished walnut table where every assumption made during the past several months had quietly come to an end. I looked toward Michael first. His shoulders had relaxed, and the confidence he carried into the meeting had been replaced with something far more valuable. He looked thoughtful. He looked willing to understand. "Mom," he asked softly, "did Dad really expect this day would happen?" I smiled gently before answering. "Your father never tried to predict people. He simply believed that important decisions should always belong to the person who must live with them." Michael lowered his eyes and slowly nodded. I could almost see him remembering countless conversations with Harold throughout his childhood. Rebecca remained silent for several moments before finally speaking. Her voice was steady, but noticeably quieter than before. "Margaret," she said, "I honestly believed I was helping you prepare for the future. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what you wanted because I became convinced I already knew." I appreciated her honesty. It takes courage to recognize when good intentions quietly become unwanted control. I reached across the table and rested my hand gently over hers. "I never doubted your heart," I said. "I only wish someone would remember that I was still capable of making my own decisions." Rebecca's eyes filled with quiet emotion as she nodded. Daniel remained respectfully silent, allowing our family conversation to unfold naturally. His role had never been to settle emotions. It had simply been to protect Harold's final wishes. I looked down at the fountain pen resting beside my folder. For several long moments I held it in my hand, while everyone watched without saying a word. Then I smiled softly and placed it back onto the table. "I am not signing anything today," I said calmly. No one objected. No one looked disappointed. The room remained peaceful. "This does not mean I am refusing change," I continued. "It simply means I deserve the opportunity to choose the moment when change feels right for me." Daniel immediately nodded. "Mrs. Collins is under absolutely no obligation to make any decision today," he confirmed. Harold's revised estate plan was written specifically to protect that freedom. Michael slowly exhaled before looking toward Rebecca. She quietly reached for his hand, and together they turned back toward me. "I understand now," Michael said. "We kept treating time like a schedule instead of a personal journey." His words settled over the room with remarkable honesty. Rebecca smiled gently. "From now on," she said, "I will ask before I assume, and I will listen before I suggest." I smiled warmly. That is all any family truly owes one another. Daniel carefully gathered the unsigned documents and returned them to the portfolio without the slightest hint of disappointment. The meeting had not ended with signatures, dramatic speeches, or winners and losers. It ended with something Harold would have valued far more. Every person in that room left with a better understanding that love is never measured by how successfully we plan another person's future. Love is measured by how faithfully we protect another person's right to choose that future for themselves. As we stood to leave the conference room together, I realized the greatest burden I had carried since Harold's passing had quietly disappeared. For the first time in many months, I no longer felt like someone everyone needed to guide. I felt like myself again, and that was the greatest decision I made without ever signing a single page. Several months passed, and life slowly settled into a rhythm that no longer revolved around legal documents or difficult conversations. Summer arrived quietly, filling the garden with the colors Harold loved most. Every Saturday morning, I carried a cup of coffee onto the back porch before the neighborhood fully awakened, watching sunlight spread across the roses we had planted together over 4 decades of marriage. For the first time since losing him, I no longer measured my days by what was missing. I measured them by the quiet peace I had finally found. Michael continued visiting almost every weekend, but something had changed between us. He no longer arrived carrying plans, suggestions, or solutions. Instead, he brought fresh pastries from the neighborhood bakery, and we spent long mornings talking about ordinary things. Sometimes we remembered Harold's endless patience whenever a home improvement project took twice as long as expected. Other mornings we laughed about old family vacations, embarrassing childhood stories, or recipes that never quite turned out the way Harold promised they would. Those conversations slowly gave us back something grief had almost taken away. We became a mother and son again instead of two people trying to manage a difficult future. Rebecca changed in ways that were even more meaningful because they happened so naturally. Whenever she visited, she never assumed what needed to be done. Before offering advice, she simply asked, "Margaret, what would you like?" It was such a small question, yet it carried enormous respect. Sometimes I accepted her ideas. Sometimes I preferred my own. Either way, the decision belonged to me, and that simple difference transformed our relationship. We no longer spoke about the house as though it were waiting for its next owner. We spoke about it as the place where our family continued making memories together. Late that autumn, Daniel invited me to his office one final time to review my own estate plan. We spent the afternoon organizing everything with complete clarity so that one day my wishes would be just as easy for my family to understand as Harold's had been. Before I left, Daniel smiled warmly and said something I will never forget. Harold did not leave behind a complicated legal strategy, he said. He left behind a reminder that the greatest gift we can give the people we love is confidence in their own judgment. As I drove home beneath trees glowing with autumn colors, I realized how true those words were. Harold had never tried to control the future from beyond his lifetime. He simply refused to let fear, grief, or good intentions quietly replace my own voice. One peaceful evening, I carried his handwritten letter into the garden just before sunset. The gentle breeze moved through the maple tree he planted during our 10th year of marriage, and the golden light settled softly across the porch where we had shared countless evenings together. I unfolded the letter one last time and reread its final lines before carefully folding it again. Then I placed it inside the wooden memory box where I kept our wedding photographs, anniversary cards, and every small reminder of the beautiful life we had built together. Looking toward the house, I finally understood what Harold had protected all along. It was never only the walls, the land, or the family home. Those things mattered, but they were never the heart of our story. The true inheritance he left behind was the quiet courage to trust myself, the wisdom to choose my own path without fear, and the reminder that respect is the strongest foundation any family can ever build. As the last light of day faded across the garden, I smiled peacefully, knowing that no one had truly lost anything that afternoon in Daniel's office. Instead, we had all found something we nearly overlooked. We found our way back to one another by first remembering how to honor the dignity, the voice, and the freedom of the person we loved. Thank you for listening and for being part of our community. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories.